This video has the instructions for the hand-sewn pincushion. To make your pincushion, you'll need the following items: some fabric, pins, tailor's chalk, needle and thread, different scissors, a piece of paper, a pencil and a ruler. You start your pincushion by making a paper template, or in sewing terms we call it a paper pattern. Your template for your pincushion needs to be 15 by 15 centimeters squared. To do this, I'm putting the 15 line of my ruler on the edge of my piece of paper. I'm then putting a mark at the 0 line. I do that on two sides, then I use my ruler to line up the two marks and draw a line across, and then repeat on the other side. Where the lines interconnect is where the square will be, and this will ensure your square is 15 by 15 centimeters. Next, I take some paper scissors or craft scissors and I cut my square, and I want to make sure that I'm doing this evenly, so when I use it to cut out my fabric later, my fabric will also be 15 by 15 centimeters square. I'm then taking my pencil to mark on my piece of paper how big the measurements are, so I can keep this square and use it again in later projects. Next, I'm going to prepare my fabric. So I'm going to open it out and use an iron to remove any creases. Always ask permission to use the iron before you go ahead and use it, especially if you've never used an iron before. They can be quite hot and dangerous. I'm going over all those creases with my iron until I have removed them all. Next, I'm going to take my fabric and fold it in half. I've chosen to use the same piece of fabric for both sides of my pincushion, so when I fold it in half I can cut out two squares at the same time. You can see I am pinning those squares to my fabric, and then I'm using fabric scissors to cut out the two pieces of fabric evenly around the paper template that I made earlier. Take the pins out and set your fabric aside. Next, I'm going to take my two pieces of fabric and place one on top of the other, right sides together, or good sides together. We always sew inside out, so we must make sure that the good sides are facing in, so when we've finished our project, the good sides will be facing out. I am pinning my two pieces of fabric together and getting tailor's chalk to mark the lines where I'm going to sew. Your sewing should be about 1 to 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. This is called the seam allowance, the distance from the edge of the fabric from where we sew. Use tailor's chalk or a pencil to mark all the way around your fabric for your pincushion. On the last side, you need to leave a gap, and this is so you can turn your pincushion around the right way later and then put stuffing inside. Next, we're going to prepare our hand needle for sewing our pincushion together. You want to remove about 1 meter worth of thread and use thread scissors to snip that off. Collect your thread and hold the thread right near the edge of the thread where you have cut it. Collect your needle and push the end of the thread through the eye of the needle. You then want to bring your thread all the way through so it is doubled over in length, and then line up the edges of the thread. We then use a knotting technique to put a knot in the end of the thread, and how we do that is wrapping the thread around your finger and pushing the ends through the loop, and you need to repeat this 3 times. The reason why we do it 3 times is so the knot is big enough to stop the ends of the thread from going straight through the fabric. 1 or 2 knots just isn't enough, and the knots need to be right on top of each other. Once you have prepared your thread, you're going to start sewing your pincushion together. We are going to use a stitch called the running stitch. We bring the thread all the way through from one side of the pincushion to the other, so the knot stops that thread from going all the way through. We then move the needle about 1/2 centimeter from where it came out and move it down about 1/2 centimeter and pull the thread all the way through, being very careful it doesn't get caught up on any pins or edges of fabric, and taking it slowly so no knots form. We repeat this, pushing the needle through about 1/2 centimetre at a time, carefully moving the thread so it goes all the way through. Again, we will repeat this, 1/2 centimetre in and then back out, and bring that thread all the way through, carefully so no knots form. When you get to the corner, you can turn that corner and continue the process. 1/2 centimetre stitches or 5mm, and carefully bringing it through so no knots form. If you do get a knot, just very carefully guide the thread through so that knot releases. We continue this process all the way around the pincushion until we reach the other side where we are to leave the gap for flipping and stuffing the pincushion. So again, we're just going forwards 1/2 centimetre and under 1/2 centimetre and slowly bringing the thread through and releasing any little knots that may happen as you're bringing that thread through, and just continue the process over and over again until you get all the way around back to where that gap has started. When you reach the last section of the pincushion, you want to finish about 5 or 6 centimetres before you started the original section. An easy way for beginners to finish off their sewing is to cut their remaining thread in half at the eye of the needle and then do a knot to tie the two pieces together. You probably want to do 2 or 3 knots, one on top of the other again, and this is just like how you would do it as you're beginning to tie your shoelaces. Continue tying your knots until you feel the end of your sewing is secure. Next, you want to trim the corners just a little bit, just to take away some excess fabric from the inside of your pincushion. Make sure you do not cut your stitches while you're trimming those corners. Once you've done that, you can flip your pincushion around the right way, and taking care to make sure that the corners are poking out. You can use a finger or an end of a pencil to get those corners sitting out so it's nice and square. Next up, we're going to stuff our pincushion. You want to use enough stuffing inside so you have a nice firm square shape. As you place the stuffing inside of the pincushion, make sure that you are pushing it into the corners of the shape so that it fills it up nicely. The last thing we need to do is hand sew that gap shut. To do this, we're going to use a stitch called the ladder stitch. First of all, you need to take off about 1 metre of thread and snip the end with some thread scissors, and then thread the eye of the needle, just like we did when we first started this project. Once you've threaded the needle, bring the thread through so it's double-stranded again, and tie a triple knot in the end of the thread, just the same as we did at the start of the project. To close the gap, we're going to use a stitch called the ladder stitch. It can also be known as the blind stitch or the invisible stitch. To create this stitch, you essentially go from one side of the gap to the other and going underneath the fold on each side of the fabric. So you can see here, going from the 1 across the 2, then underneath the fold to the 3, then over the top to the 4, underneath the fold to the 5, and so on. What you want to do is pick up your needle and bring the needle through from underneath the fold on one end and bring it through to the outside of your fabric. Make sure when you pull the thread that the knot is securely underneath the fold of the fabric. Just like in the previous image, what we're going to do is go across the gap and underneath the fold of the fabric on the other side. Then we go back across the gap and underneath the fold again of the other side. Then we go straight back across the gap and underneath the fold of the other side. I like to use an analogy of walking across the road when I'm doing a ladder stitch. So that is to walk across the road and then underneath the pavement, with the fold of the fabric being the pavement. Bring the needle through, then walk across the road again, straight across to the other side, and then underneath the pavement. Now you can see on this stitch that the thread is beginning to look like the rungs of a ladder, but when you gently pull on the thread, it will close the gap and the stitches will disappear, and this is why it's also called the invisible stitch or the blind stitch. You continue to go across the road and underneath the pavement until you get to the other end of your gap. You should gently close the gap as you go, because if you wait till you get to the right on the other side, the thread can snap if you are too rough with it as you pull those threads together. When you've made it across to the other side and your gap is shut, you need to tie off your thread. Now you do this by doing 3 tiny little stitches, one exactly on top of the other, until the thread is nice and tight. Lastly, you wrap the thread around the needle and pull it through in itself, and that will tie a secure knot. You can then push the needle through the gap and bring it out into the middle of the pincushion. Pull on the thread so it's tight and chop that off, and then the ends of the thread will be inside your pincushion. So there you go, you have now created a hand sewn pincushion. You can pop some pins in that and start putting it to work with your next sewing project. Well done!